The steady hum of jet engines filled the cabin as Flight 457 made its way across the Atlantic. Most passengers had settled into their routines, some dozing with their necks at awkward angles, others absorbed in movies on tiny screens, and a few flipping through magazines they'd probably read 3 times already. It was that odd time during a long flight when minutes seemed to stretch like rubber bands, and everyone just wanted to get to their destination. Sarah Chun, a flight attendant of 8 years, was just finishing up her drink service when she heard the first cry. At first, she thought it was just another passenger having trouble with their seat, or maybe a kid throwing a tantrum, but something in the sound made her pause. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was pain. The cry came again, sharper this time, from the direction of the rear bathroom. Sarah exchanged glances with her colleague Mike, who was stacking used cups nearby. They'd both been in the air long enough to know when something wasn't right. "I'll check it out," Sarah said, already moving down the aisle. She reached the bathroom door and knocked gently. "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" The response was a muffled groan, followed by heavy breathing. Sarah's heart rate picked up. She'd done her emergency training, sure, but nothing quite prepared you for the real thing. "Mom, I need you to let me know if you need help," Sarah called out, keeping her voice steady despite her growing concern. The door lock clicked, and Sarah caught a glimpse of a young woman's face, contorted in pain. She couldn't have been more than 25. I think the baby's coming," the woman gasped, her knuckles white as she gripped the tiny sink. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. "Mike," she called out, trying not to alarm the other passengers. "I need you to make an announcement. Ask if there's a doctor on board." The next few minutes were chaos, wrapped in the confines of airplane protocol. Mike's voice came over the intercom, professional but urgent. Passengers stirred in their seats, craning their necks to see what was happening. An elderly man in 14C kept insisting his wife had taken a first aid course 30 years ago, while a teenager filming everything on his phone had to be firmly asked to stop. Then came the turbulence, because of course it did. The plane shuddered, and Sarah had to brace herself against the wall while trying to help the woman out of the cramped bathroom. They couldn't deliver a baby in there. It was barely big enough for one person to turn around. "I'm a nurse," a woman's voice cut through the commotion. Sarah looked up to see a middle-aged woman with short gray hair making her way toward them. "Labor and delivery, 20 years experience." Sarah could have hugged her right there. The nurse, who introduced herself as Linda, took charge with the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen it all before, even if never at 300 feet. They managed to create a makeshift delivery area in the galley, using blankets and whatever supplies they could gather from the first aid kit. "What's her name, sweetheart?" Linda asked the young woman, who was now lying on their improvised bed, but she just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She wouldn't answer any questions, wouldn't even make eye contact. Sarah had dealt with all kinds of passengers, angry ones, drunk ones, scared ones, but something about this woman's silence felt different. It wasn't just pain or fear in her eyes. It was something deeper, something that made Sarah's stomach twist with worry. The birth itself happened faster than anyone expected. Maybe it was the altitude, or maybe the baby was just in a hurry to make its dramatic entrance into the world. But within 20 minutes of Linda taking charge, the first cry of new life pierced through the usual airplane white noise. "It's a girl," Linda announced, wrapping the tiny baby in a clean blanket someone had offered from first class. "She's small, but she's breathing well." The mother barely looked at her child before her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness. Linda handed the baby to Sarah and immediately focused on the mother, checking her pulse and breathing. "She's stable," Linda reported after a tense moment. "Probably just exhaustion and stress." "We need to get fluids in her as soon as she wakes up," Linda added. But the mother didn't wake up, not really. When her eyes finally opened about 10 minutes later, there was something different about her. She seemed confused, disoriented. Sarah tried to hand her the baby, but she turned away, muttering something none of them could understand. The captain had already radioed ahead for medical assistance to meet them at the gate. They were still 2 hours from landing, and Sarah split her attention between caring for the newborn and checking on the mother. The baby was surprisingly calm, making little snuffling noises in Sarah's arms. The baby slept peacefully in a makeshift bassinet created from a storage container lined with blankets. It was during a moment when everyone had finally started to relax. Sarah had gone to fetch more blankets, Linda was documenting the birth details for medical records, and Mike was updating the captain. Nobody saw the mother get up. Nobody noticed her grab her small backpack from her seat. By the time Sarah returned, the woman had vanished. It didn't seem possible. How could someone just disappear on an airplane? They searched every bathroom, every corner. They asked passengers if they'd seen where she went, but it was like she'd never been there at all. No ID had been found, no boarding pass left behind. The seat she'd been in had been booked under a name that later turned out to be false. The baby slept through it all, unaware that she was now at the center of a mystery that would change multiple lives forever. Sarah sat beside the makeshift bassinet, watching the tiny chest rise and fall, wondering what kind of desperation would make a mother leave her newborn child behind. When they finally landed, the plane was met by a swarm of medical personnel, police, and social services workers. The story hit the news before the last passenger had even deplaned. Everyone wanted to know, who was the mother? Why had she run? What would happen to the baby? Sarah gave her statement to the police, describing everything she could remember about the woman. Her accent, her clothes, the way she'd avoided everyone's eyes. But it all felt inadequate, like trying to describe a dream that was already fading from memory. As she watched the social workers carry the baby away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. Something about the mother's fear, her desperate silence, suggested secrets that went deeper than anyone could guess. The baby might have been born in the space between earth and sky, but her story was only just beginning to unfold on the ground below. The neonatal unit at City General buzzed with its usual quiet energy, but there was something different about Room 3. Nurses lingered a little longer during their rounds, sneaking extra peeks at the tiny girl who'd been born somewhere over the Atlantic. They'd started calling her Sky. Not the most original nickname, but it stuck faster than anyone expected. Jenny Martinez, the social worker assigned to the case, sat in the rocking chair beside Sky's crib, updating her notes for what felt like the 100th time. 20 years on the job, and she'd never seen anything quite like this. Usually, abandoned babies came with at least some context, a desperate note, a mother's name, something to start with. Sky had nothing except a birth altitude and a whole lot of unanswered questions. "How's our little celebrity doing?" Dr. Thompson asked, walking in to check Sky's vitals. Despite being slightly premature, Sky was doing remarkably well. She had a healthy appetite and a set of lungs that could wake up half the ward when she wanted attention. "It's famous enough to make the morning shows," Jenny replied, showing him her phone. The The story had blown up overnight, headlines ranging from "Miracle at 300 feet" to "Mystery Mother Vanishes Mid-Flight." Some reporters had even tried sneaking into the hospital dressed as delivery people, hoping to get exclusive photos. "Any leads on the mother?" Dr. Thompson asked, marking something on Sky's chart. Jenny shook her head. Airport security cameras showed someone matching her description leaving through a side exit, but she was wearing a hood and kept her head down. The airline's passenger manifest was no help. The seat was booked under a fake name with a prepaid credit card. The police had interviewed everyone on the flight, but most passengers had been sleeping or watching movies when the woman boarded. The few who remembered her gave conflicting descriptions. She was tall, she was short, she had an accent, she didn't speak at all. The only clear memories came from the flight attendant Sarah and the nurse Linda, but even their descriptions felt incomplete, like trying to describe someone glimpsed through fog. Two passengers in particular caught Jenny's attention when she reviewed the police interviews. The first was Jonah Maxwell, a biochemist returning from a conference in Europe. He'd been sitting 3 rows behind the empty seat where the mother had supposedly been. His statement was methodical, almost clinical, noting the exact time he'd heard the commotion, the sequence of events, the color of the woman's sweater, gray or possibly blue in the cabin lighting. The other passenger, Caleb Rodriguez, had been in first class, but had apparently moved to economy to get away from a chatty seatmate. His statement was more colorful, full of details about the atmosphere on the plane and how everyone had pulled together to help. He'd even offered his expensive cashmere sweater as an extra blanket for the baby, waving off the flight attendant's protests about potential damage. Neither man seemed particularly connected to the case, but something about their interviews nagged at Jenny. Maybe it was the way they both mentioned feeling oddly drawn to check on the baby's welfare after landing, or how they separately asked about the process for keeping updated on Sky's situation. "We've got the DNA results back from the lab," Dr. Thompson said, pulling Jenny from her thoughts. "They're running them through every database they can access, hoping to find a familial match somewhere." Jenny nodded, watching Sky grasp at a strand of her dark hair that had fallen within reach. The baby's features were starting to settle, almond-shaped eyes, a tiny dimple in her left cheek when she yawned, skin a warm olive tone that could have hinted at any number of ethnic backgrounds. The media circus around Sky's story grew with each passing day. Local news bands parked outside the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching up like metal flowers, searching for the sun. Jenny had to coordinate with hospital security to arrange Sky's transfer to a foster home. Everyone wanted to protect this little girl who'd literally dropped into their lives from the sky. Carol and Mike Bennett, experienced foster parents who specialized in caring for infants, welcomed Sky into their home with the quiet confidence of people who'd done this many times before. Their house sat on a peaceful suburban street with a wooden swing set in the backyard and cheerful curtains in the windows. It was exactly the kind of normal Sky needed after her dramatic entrance into the world. "The hardest part," Carol confided to Jenny during one of her check-ins, "is knowing she might have family out there somewhere who don't even know she exists." The DNA tests were taking longer than usual, something about contaminated samples and needing to run additional markers. Jenny tried not to read too much into the delays, but years of social work had taught her that complications usually meant something interesting was about to surface. Meanwhile, she kept digging into the flight manifest, cross-referencing passenger names with international databases, looking for any pattern that might make sense of Sky's mother's disappearance. The woman had to have had help. Someone must have given her the fake ID, bought the ticket, planned an escape route from the airport. Jonah Maxwell and Caleb Rodriguez kept appearing at the edges of the investigation. Neither man had any obvious connection to the case, but they both seemed invested in Sky's welfare. Jonah had called twice to ask about the DNA testing process, his questions specific and technical. Caleb had shown up at Jenny's office with a stuffed elephant he'd seen in a store window, claiming something about it just felt right for Sky. "I know it's weird," Caleb had said, running a hand through his curly hair. "I just can't stop thinking about her, you know? Like, who leaves their baby on a plane?" "What kind of trouble was she in?" "Of course." Jenny understood the feeling. Something about Sky's case felt different from the usual abandoned baby situations she dealt with. The mother's actions seemed less like rejection and more like protection. The timing of the birth, the fake ID, the calculated disappearance, it all suggested planning rather than panic. The break in the case came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Sky's birth. Jenny was at her desk, sorting through another pile of media requests when her phone rang. It was the lab. "Mrs. Martinez, we need you to come down here. There's something about the baby's DNA results you should see in person." Jenny arrived at the lab 20 minutes later, her heart beating a little faster than usual. The technician, a young woman with bright purple hair and serious eyes, pulled up 2 DNA profiles on her computer screen. "We found a familial match," she said, pointing to highlighted sections of the profiles. "Actually, we found 2, and here's the thing. They're related to each other, but they didn't know it. They're both passengers from that flight." Jenny felt her breath catch as she leaned closer to read the names on the profiles. There they were, the 2 men who'd been hovering at the edges of this mystery since the beginning, Jonah Maxwell and Caleb Rodriguez. "They're half-brothers," the technician continued, "and based on these markers, they share a father with Sky's mother." Jenny sat back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. 2 men on the same flight, unknown brothers, both unknowingly flying alongside their niece and her desperate mother. It wasn't just a story about an abandoned baby anymore. It was about family secrets, hidden connections, and whatever trouble had driven a young woman to give birth and vanish at 300 feet. Now she had to figure out how to tell 2 strangers they weren't just witnesses to Sky's story, they were part of it. Jenny decided to meet with Jonah and Caleb separately at first. Breaking news like this required a delicate touch, and from what she'd seen of their personalities, they'd process it differently. She called Jonah first, arranging to meet him at his research lab during his lunch break. The lab smelled of disinfectant and coffee. Jonah sat perfectly still as Jenny explained the DNA results, his face betraying nothing except a slight tightening around his eyes. He was wearing a crisp blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a pen tucked behind his ear, the picture of scientific precision. "You're certain about this?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "The probability of error in genetic testing can be significant if proper controls aren't dashed." "We ran the tests 3 times," Jenny interrupted gently. "The relationship markers are clear. You and Caleb Rodriguez share a biological father, and your father is also Sky's maternal grandfather." Jonah stood up and walked to a window overlooking the university campus. Students rushed between buildings, their lives continuing as normal while his world tilted on its axis. "I always knew I was donor-conceived," he said finally. "My mother told me when I was 12, but she said the records were sealed, that tracking down biological relatives would be impossible." Things have changed with DNA testing, Jenny explained. Connections that were once hidden are now coming to light all the time. Caleb took the news differently. Jenny met him at a busy coffee shop of his choosing, where he ordered some complicated drink with extra shots and talked the barista's ear off about his latest business venture. But when Jenny shared the test results, his usual energy deflated like a punctured balloon. "A brother," he repeated, stirring his coffee absently. "Man, that's heavy. I mean, I've got step-siblings from both my mom's marriages, but this is different. This is blood." He pulled out his phone, thumbing through his photos until he found one from the flight. "I took this when they were moving the mother to the galley. You can barely see her. But was that my sister? My half-sister?" Jenny nodded. "Based on the DNA, yes. We still don't know her name or where she is, but she's definitely related to both you and Jonah." Caleb let out a low whistle. "And that makes Guy my niece. Our niece. Wow. Just wow." The next step was getting the brothers together. Jenny arranged a meeting at her office, neutral territory. She arrived early to find Jonah already there, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. Caleb burst in 5 minutes late, apologizing and juggling a take-out coffee cup and his phone. The contrast between them was striking. Jonah looked like he'd just stepped out of a scientific journal, while Caleb could have been the cover model for a startup magazine. They sized each other up with the awkward curiosity of strangers who suddenly found themselves sharing a profound connection. "So," Caleb broke the silence, "you're my brother, half-brother, whatever. This is wild, right? Like, what are the odds we'd both be on that flight?" "Approximately 1 in several million, assuming random distribution," Jonah replied automatically, then grimaced. "Ugh, sorry. I process things through numbers when I'm nervous." A hint of a smile crossed Caleb's face. "Hey, no worries. I talk too much when I'm nervous. Just ask anyone who's ever been stuck in an elevator with me." Jenny watched as the two men gradually found their footing with each other. Caleb did most of the talking, sharing stories about his chaotic childhood with various step-siblings. Jonah listened intently, occasionally offering precise observations that made Caleb laugh with their unexpected dry humor. "Can we see her?" Caleb asked suddenly. "Sky, I mean, now that we know she's family." Jenny had anticipated this. "The Bennetts, her foster parents, are open to a visit, but I need you both to understand something first. This isn't just about discovering family. Sky needs stability, protection. Whatever made your sister run, she was scared enough to leave her baby behind." Both men sobered at that reminder. Jonah leaned forward, his scientific detachment cracking slightly. "Have there been any leads on finding her?" "Nothing concrete," Jenny admitted. "But now that we know about the family connection, we might be able to track her through other relatives. Did either of you know anything about your biological father?" They both shook their heads. Caleb said, "Mom always told me he was just a number at a clinic, said he gave me my curly hair and my ability to do mental math, but that's all she knew." "Same here," Jonah added, "though I suspect my mother knew more than she told me. She has a letter somewhere from the clinic. I never asked to see it. It didn't seem important before." Jenny made a note. "That could be helpful. Any information about the donor might help us understand your sister's situation." The conversation shifted to practical matters. Both men had to undergo background checks before they could visit Sky. There were forms to fill out, procedures to follow. Through it all, Jenny noticed something interesting happening. Jonah and Caleb were unconsciously mirroring each other's movements, leaning in at the same times, sharing glances that seemed increasingly familiar. "You know what's weird?" Caleb said as they were wrapping up. "I remember seeing you on the flight. You were reading some thick science book, and I thought, man, that guy looks so focused. I almost offered to trade seats with you when that kid behind you kept kicking your chair." Jonah looked surprised. "I remember you too. You gave up your sweater for the baby." "I thought it was an unusually generous gesture for a stranger. Guess she wasn't really a stranger after all," Caleb said softly. As they left her office, Jenny watched the two men walk toward the elevator together. They were still awkward, still processing, but there was something else there, too. A tentative connection, a shared purpose. They had both been only children in their own ways, and now they weren't just brothers. They were uncles with a responsibility to a tiny girl who needed them. That night, Jenny updated Sky's file with new information. The baby's family tree was starting to take shape, branches reaching out in unexpected directions. But there was still a crucial piece missing. A young mother somewhere out there, carrying her own secrets and fears. Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that finding her was going to be the key to understanding everything else. She added one final note before closing the file. Subject demonstrates strong family resemblance to both newly identified uncles. See Rodriguez' side dimple, Maxwell's eyes. DNA has revealed the connections. Now we wait to see what else these connections will reveal. The first time Jonah and Caleb visited Sky together, the differences in their personalities became even more apparent. Caleb showed up with 3 different stuffed animals, unable to choose just one. Jonah brought a carefully researched list of questions about infant development. Carol Bennett, Sky's foster mother, watched them with gentle amusement as they awkwardly took turns holding their niece. "She's so tiny," Caleb whispered, cradling Sky like she might shatter. "I mean, I knew babies were small, but man." "Actually, she's in the 60th percentile for height and weight now," Jonah pointed out, then caught himself. "Sorry, I've been reading studies on infant growth patterns." "Of course you have," Caleb grinned. "Bet you've got spreadsheets and everything." "Just a few basic data tracking models." Sky chose that moment to grab Jonah's finger, her whole hand wrapping around it with surprising strength. Something in his carefully maintained expression cracked, and for a moment he looked as overwhelmed as Caleb. After the visit, they ended up at a nearby diner, neither quite ready to go their separate ways. Caleb ordered a giant slice of apple pie. Jonah stuck to black coffee, which he methodically doctored with exactly 2 sugars. "I found my mom's letter," Jonah said suddenly, "about the donor. I spent all weekend going through old files looking for it." Caleb put down his fork. "Yeah? What did it say?" Jonah pulled out a carefully preserved envelope. The paper yellowed with age. "It's from the clinic. They called him donor 2457. He was a medical student at the time, 24 years old. Perfect health record, high IQ scores, athletic background." "Sounds like a real catch," Caleb joked, but his voice was oddly tight. "My mom never kept anything like that," Jonah continued. "Just told me the basics when I was 13 and getting curious about why I didn't look like my stepdad." "How did you feel about it, finding out?" Caleb pushed his pie around the plate. "Confused, I guess, mad for a while. Not about the donor thing, but about feeling like I'd been living someone else's story. You know what I mean?" Jonah nodded slowly. I immersed myself in genetics research after my mother told me, wanted to understand exactly how DNA worked, what parts of myself came from where. It's partly why I became a biochemist. And now here we are, DNA proving we're brothers. Caleb leaned back in his booth. You think there are others out there? More siblings? Statistically, it's likely. Most donors from that era helped create multiple pregnancies. That's why finding our sister is so important. She might know more about our biological father's history. The waitress came by to refill their coffee cups. Both men sat in silence for a moment, watching the steam rise. I remember something else, Caleb said finally. When my mom told me about the donor, she mentioned the clinic was part of some big study. Something about tracking the kids long term, seeing how they turned out. She never enrolled me in it, but said she wanted me to have a normal life. Jonah's eyes sharpened with interest. A study? What was it called? Man, I don't remember. It was ages ago, but maybe my mom would know. She keeps everything. Every report card, every birthday card. Probably still has my baby teeth in a box somewhere. They spent the next week digging into their past from different angles. Jonah took a methodical approach, creating a timeline of the clinic's history and cross-referencing it with medical studies from that period. Caleb went the personal route, visiting his mom and spending an afternoon going through old boxes in her attic. Found it, Caleb called Jonah late one night, his voice excited. Mom had this whole packet about the study. It was called the Legacy Project. They were tracking donor-conceived kids to study genetic influences on personality and career choices, Caleb added. Jonah was already typing on his computer. The Legacy Project. Yes, here it is. It ran from 1985 to 1995, following children conceived through their donor program. But most of the records were sealed when the clinic closed. Closed? Why? Some kind of scandal, but the details are vague. The clinic changed names, moved locations. The paper trail goes cold around 1996. They met again the next day, this time at Jonah's apartment. The place was exactly as Caleb had imagined it. Minimalist furniture, books everywhere, and a whiteboard covered in neat handwriting. Jonah had mapped out everything they knew about their biological father and the clinic. Look at this, Jonah pointed to a news clipping. The clinic director, Dr. James Harrison, resigned suddenly in 1996, no explanation given. Then the whole operation was sold to a larger medical group. You think he knew something? About our father? Caleb asked. Maybe. Or about why our sister was running. Think about it. She had to know she was pregnant when she got on that plane. She chose that flight for a reason. Caleb flopped onto Jonah's pristine couch, rumbling the carefully arranged throw pillows. This is like some spy movie stuff. Secret studies, closed clinics, mysterious donors. No wonder she was scared. They shared their findings with Jenny, who added them to Sky's growing file. The baby was thriving in the Bennett's care, but everyone knew it was temporary. Eventually, decisions would have to be made about her permanent placement. Have you two thought about what role you want to play in Sky's life? Jenny asked during one of their updates. Long term, I mean. The brothers exchanged glances. They'd been spending more time together, getting used to the idea of being family. Jonah had even started showing up at Caleb's pickup basketball games, though he refused to play. Caleb, in turn, had developed a surprising interest in Jonah's research, asking questions that showed he'd been doing his own reading. We want to be involved, Caleb said firmly. Whatever happens, she's our niece. But we also need to find our sister, Jonah added. Sky deserves to know her mother, to understand why she left. Jenny nodded, noting how they'd started speaking as a unit, using we instead of I. It was progress, this newfound brotherhood. But she worried about what they might uncover as they dug deeper into their shared past. Some family secrets, once unearthed, couldn't be buried again. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb said quietly, "Whatever we find out about our father, about the clinic, about our sister, we'll handle it together. Right, bro?" "Right," Jonah agreed, and for once he didn't qualify his answer with statistics or probabilities. Some things he was learning didn't need scientific precision to be true. The meeting at Child Services felt too formal, with everyone sitting around a polished conference table like they were discussing a business merger instead of a baby's future. Jenny had called them all together, Jonah, Caleb, the Bennetts, and a handful of officials, to talk about Sky's permanent placement. "The fact is," Jenny began, her hands folded on top of Sky's thick file, "we need to start making long-term decisions. Sky needs stability, a permanent home. Usually in cases like this, after a reasonable search for the birth mother, we'd start